preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the 15th Annual State of World Jewry Address. I'm Matthew Bronfman, Chairman of the Bronfman Center for Jewish Life at the 92nd Street Y. In a few minutes, you're going to hear Malcolm Hoenlein, and we're absolutely privileged to have him give this address tonight. For 1 second, I'd like to tell you about the person I'm going to introduce, Rabbi David Woznicka, who in his 4 or 5 years here has done a spectacular job running the Bronfman Center. Okay, sorry about that. David Woznicka, who's the director of the Center for Jewish Life at the 92nd Street Y, has been doing a spectacular job, and we have approximately 800 students who come through here every year studying, from unaffiliated Jews to marginally affiliated Jews to very affiliated Jews. It's a program that's expanded dramatically under his leadership, and it is really my pleasure tonight to let him introduce Malcolm, and so I give you Rabbi Woznicka.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. As Matthew said, this is a major address here at the 92nd Street Y. As is my minhag hamakom, the custom that I do, I always like to tell you about upcoming programs that I think you'll find of particular interest in the next few months. The Forum on Contemporary Values is a 3-evening series in which Rabbi Joseph Telushkin joins me in a series of dialogues where we probe our guests not so much on their perspectives in life, not so much on their views in life, but their values. On what basis do they make their decisions? On what basis do they come to their decisions? How do their decisions influence their personal lives? How do their decisions influence their values? The whole focus of the series is on values, and I'm particularly pleased to tell you that Dennis Prager is our first guest in March, Natan Sharansky the following week, that's March 8th, and on March 23rd, A.M. Rosenthal of the New York Times. The tickets for that series are selling very quickly, but there are seats available. In May, Mayor Ehud Olmert, the mayor of Jerusalem, joins Shoshana Cardin and Professor Shlomo Aronson of Hebrew University for a discussion entitled New Challenges for Israel and Jerusalem. What are the issues that Israel and Jerusalem will face as she moves into the 21st century? There is a program with Dr. Norman Cohen, a 2-evening series on the book of Genesis, in particular Joseph. I always tell people, if you think you have tsuris in your family life, you should read the book of Genesis. Brothers don't get along, husbands and wives don't get along, parents and children don't get along. Torah study can be very uplifting because you feel so terrific afterwards. We're happy that Dr. Michael Berenbaum will be here. He is the director of research at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. The program is called Holocaust Aftershocks, and we will be looking with him at how the Holocaust will be remembered. You know, this April will be 50 years since the end of the Holocaust in 1945. The question is, how will the future generations of America remember the Holocaust? How should that memory be instilled? And Dr. Michael Berenbaum is one of those people who will indeed influence that memory. You can spend a day in study this Sunday on how Judaism views the Messiah and the afterlife with David Wolpe, a day on Islam a few weeks later. You can study women in Jewish law the following month in May with Dr. Alice Shalvey. And if that's not enough to whet your appetite, in about 3 weeks, our courses begin anew, our spring courses, everything from Hebrew and Yiddish and Jewish texts, philosophy, history. Really, it's a great opportunity to have you here, and we cordially invite you to have you join us for any or all of our programs. In your packet, if you don't have enough information, by the way, all of that is included in the brochure that you were handed. In your packet are index cards. Those index cards are for your questions for this evening. Ushers will be collecting them a couple of times throughout the course of the evening. I know that Mr. Hoenlein will get to as many of them as is possible. And then, again, to whet the appetite, following this evening, you are invited to join us for a glass of either champagne or wine. I'm not sure what was decided upon, right outside the door to the right. I hope that you can be with us. Now to this evening. When you select a date with a speaker for an evening, you really never know what's going to come of it. When I spoke with Mr. Hoenlein, I don't know, sometime probably in sometime in March or April of last year, turns out that this was a good date for the 92nd Street Y. This was a good date for him, and that's terrific. We thought it was somewhat arbitrary. But I noticed that this week it turns out that the Torah portion is Yitro. Yitro is the Torah portion in the book of Exodus where the Israelites receive the Ten Commandments and Revelation. The Israelites receive the Word of God. It is the defining moment of the Jewish people. Until then, the Jews are a bunch of wandering people in the desert. My father would call us schleppers. Nevertheless, there was nothing unusual about us. And by the way, a cartoon that has been going around the 92nd Street Y, which I want to share with you. You can't read it from there, but I'll certainly tell you what it says. It's Mr. and Mrs. Moses. That's what it says here. He has his staff in his hand. She's by his side. And there are a horde of people, Israelites, following them in the desert. And she turns to him and she says, "But would you ask the burning bush for directions?" "No, not Mr. I'd rather wander in the desert for 40 years. Anyway, my friends, we receive the Torah. We no longer become a wandering people. We are a people with a purpose in life. We are to be an or lagoyim, a light unto the nations. We are supposed to strive to be a moral example to the world. I hope that as a people we will never forget our moral responsibilities to the world, and I hope as a people we will never ever forget the privilege it is to have that responsibility and the privilege it is to be a Jew. A curious thing happens before we receive the Ten Commandments, before we receive revelation, before we receive the Torah from God, and that is that we are told to wait 3 days. The Israelite people are told to wait 3 days at the base of Mount Sinai, and over the course of those 3 days, they are to abstain from sexual relations, they are to wash their clothes, they are, in effect, to take a step back for cheshbon hanefesh, for an accounting of their souls. They are to look inward and ask themselves, what is my condition? We are doing that again today as a people. We are taking a step back for our, I guess the best example I could say is an annual medical checkup. We go in to see the doctor, no matter how we feel, to learn exactly how we're doing. And this evening is just that, an opportunity to look at the spiritual, political, and social condition of the Jewish people. And we are particularly blessed to have Mr. Malcolm Hoenlein as our speaker for the annual State of World Jewry address. Malcolm is the Executive Vice Chairman of the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations, which is the coordinating body on international Jewish concerns for almost 50 national Jewish organizations. In other words, he is the head of the presidents. He has also been founding executive director of the Jewish Community Relations Council of Greater New York, as well as the founding executive director of the Greater New York Conference of Soviet Jewry. He received his bachelor's degree in political science from Temple University, master's from the University of Penn's Department of International Relations, where he also completed his doctoral coursework. He has taught international relations in the political science department at the University of Pennsylvania, and he has also served as Middle East specialist at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. He has written and lectured widely, as you know, on political, international relations, Israel and Middle East affairs, Soviet and world Jewry, the American Jewish community, political affairs, intergroup relations, as well as domestic concerns. His awards and honors include the 1983 Private Sector Initiative Award from President Reagan, the 1987 Jack D. Weiler Award for Communal Service, the 1987 Fellow of the Jerusalem College of Technology, the 1989 Millender Fellow at Brandeis University, and in 1990, the coveted Defender of Jerusalem Award. He has traveled extensively throughout Europe, Africa, the Middle East, where he meets with leading government officials. And in fact, in speaking to him at dinner this evening, I learned that he just returned from Israel for a 20-year commemoration of the Jackson-Vanik Agreement. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Mr. Malcolm Hoenlein.
Thank you. First, thanks to Rabbi Woznicka for that introduction. It's supposed to be a very dramatic build-up, so you walk out here and it looks very special. And I want to thank Matthew for his comments as well. 15 years ago, I appeared at a forum at the 92nd Street Y, but I have to tell you, I'm a lot more nervous tonight. I speak many times throughout the year, but this is a very special address, and I have tremendous respect knowing those who have delivered this prestigious message in past years. My dilemma is that I spent a lot of time preparing it. In fact, didn't sleep the last 3 nights as I worked during the nights to really put my thoughts down on paper and to come up with a coherent message. And the dilemma was what to leave out. I mean, when you look at the Sears catalog of tsaros that confront us, all the issues that one wants to cover, and I spoke to some valued friends, and each one would say, no, you have to cut, get to the point, you have to cut out these issues. And I would say to them, well, what about this issue? And they say, no, you put that in. And what about this? And the end is that it's really a sort of global state, well, maybe an intergalactic state of world Jewry that I'm going to present. So rather than cut things out, I will try to briefly cover some of them. And as I try to time myself, there's one remedy I have, and that is that I speak very fast. I was recently on a speaking tour in the South, and I was asked to address the Rotary Club there. And after they went through all of their customs and introductions, I don't know if they're any Rotarians, but they have some very special procedures that they do before the meeting begins. And there were 600 or 700 people there. They had 3 Jews, sat them at the front table to make sure I knew they were there. And very influential people. And this is in the heart of the South, and they said, listen, you get 30 minutes to speak. At the end of 30 minutes, they tug on your jacket, you sit down. So I got up and I delivered what I thought was a rather insightful analysis about the peace process in the Middle East. At the end of the 30 minutes, the tug on the jacket, I finished, and I proceeded to my seat, and nothing happened. And I sat down, and nothing happened. And a minute or two later, they started applauding. So I just figured it's another Rotary custom. At the end of the program, the president of the Rotary Club came over to me and said, listen, you might have thought that was mighty strange what happened, but you got to understand, you from New York, and you talk so fast, and we from the South, and we think so slow. We's catching up to your last paragraph, you sitting down already. So knowing that I'm speaking to a New York audience, there is a danger in it, though, you should know. While I was there, we stayed with someone, and he told us that they had wanted to put an eruv up, which, as you know, is a religious device to allow Orthodox Jews, observant Jews, to carry on the Sabbath, and it means using the telephone wires and in essentially creating an encasement of an area, enclosure of an area. And he said, I invited this rabbi down from New York, and he came before the city council. And the city council has 4 lawyers, and the rest are rednecks. And he said, and this rabbi started talking about this eruv, and he's going to hang it from here, and he's going to hang it from there, and the telephone wires. And he said, finally, these guys, their eyes was glazing over. And one of the non-lawyers leaned back in his chair. He says, hold it 1 minute. Let me get this straight. You Jews want to hang an Arab from where? So I hope that despite the fact that I'm going to talk very fast, there won't be any misunderstanding about what I'm speaking about. And I don't want to hang anybody anywhere. The one sacrifice will be about jokes. It said in the introduction, I'm a storyteller, and I really do enjoy interspersing stories, but it's the one thing I agreed that I would, to myself, that I would sacrifice. And I know that there's at least one person sitting in the audience who's ready to give me that proverbial tug when my time is up. I hope perhaps to do a written version where I'll be able to flesh out some of these ideas that I'm not able to talk about completely today. I have tried to boil this down into several categories and decided that I would allocate time for each one. So if I abruptly end, it means that in my own mind, I know the time is up. And you see, putting a watch here, you know the story they tell of a non-Jew accompanied a neighbor to the synagogue, and he asked at each stage what was the meaning of the bowing at Modim, and he said, this is a sign of reverence. And he asked, why did you cover your eyes at Shema? And he said, this is for concentration, and this is the importance of the Shema. And then when it came to opening the ark, and he asked what the significance was, and he explained the Torah scrolls. And then came time for the sermon, and the rabbi took off his watch and put it down. He said, what does that mean? He said, not a damn thing. So, so I want you, putting it down doesn't mean anything. But as I said, no stories, so I'm not going to do any. As I prepared this, The fact is that each of the subjects really warrants a lecture unto itself. Two Chinese sayings came to mind as I prepared. The first is a curse, may you live in interesting times, and boy, is that true. The second is that prophecy is very difficult, especially about the future. I would add, even about the past, as I try to assess the implications of all that has happened in 1994. This was a year of revolutionary change that continues into 1995. The world is in a dynamic flux of constant change. Even if some elements of uncertainty are diminished, others replace them. And this is an appropriate year for me as well to have been given this honor and this assignment. This was sort of a watershed year in my personal history, as it was in Jewish history. For this year, I met my grandchild and my grandfather. During the course of this past summer, my mother, who's here from Philadelphia, received an invitation, and I'm not going to go into the whole story. It's very bizarre, and it's been written up in part, and it's too complicated, and I certainly don't have the time to do it. But we received an invitation inviting us to come to the dedication of a synagogue in a small community south of Nuremberg called Emroit. And there was no cover note, and I then inquired of the foreign ministry in Germany and the ambassador, and they came back with a message that the dedication, which was the following Sunday, was very important and that we should attend. And so my mother and my son and myself and an aunt went to Germany. We arrived there 20 minutes before the ceremony. And as we came and approached the synagogue, there were hundreds of people gathered. We entered and we saw a huge plaque dedicating the synagogue to the memory of my grandparents, aunts, and uncles, and two other families who died there during the Holocaust. And as we entered, there was a choir of 40 or 50 voices singing in perfect Hebrew, but not a Jew amongst them. And they proceeded to say the afternoon prayers, but there wasn't a minyan of Jews. And we were told that my great-grandfather in 1822 helped to build that synagogue. And my grandfather on November 8th of 1938 was the last person to pray in that synagogue before it was destroyed on Kristallnacht. A group of Christian women undertook to do this project against great opposition from those who felt guilty and from those who felt no guilt. And yet they were so determined that they proceeded, no matter what obstacles they encountered, and eventually got support. And as they did the rebuilding, they found a geniza, an archives with books and a history of a community, talitot, tefillin, a community. It opened 4 centuries of Jewish history in the roof of this long-abandoned building. As I stood there before the ark, I realized that here I was being bound through the generations and through the centuries with my ancestors about whom I knew nothing. My history had ended in an abyss in 1945. I was being pulled through the generations to be introduced to them, those who stood in those very places in the generations that preceded it. There was a bond that no enemy and no persecution, no weapon, no hatred could destroy. I contemplated, what did my grandfather think when he built that synagogue? They built it out of bricks so strong that even the fire of Kristallnacht didn't destroy it. I'm sure he thought he was building forever. But he knew that this was his obligation to future generations. And because of what he did, my grandfather was what he was, and my father what he was, and what I am, is all attributable to what they were. I thought, what did my grandfather think? Could he have imagined that the people with whom they had lived for at least 300 years would that night turn against them, set fire to the synagogue, and ultimately betray them as they went to their deaths in the concentration camp? What is it that is really of lasting significance? I don't know what money they had. I don't know what possessions they had. But I know that there is something that was more important, that transcends all times, that they gave to me, and that links us, a heritage, a value system, an ethical system, a Torah that transcends all time and all barriers. And I kept thinking as I stood there, how much has the world changed in these 50 years? We're going to mark the anniversary of the end of World War II, the liberation of Dachau and Auschwitz next week, in fact. How much has the world changed? Is it a more humane place? Is it a more caring place? We only need to look at the events that we see each day in Bosnia, where we watch the massacre of children, the rape and torture of women, and the civilized world's only response is send Band-Aid and milk powder. For years we have stood by and to see the decimation of people. We see it in Kashmir where 100,000 have died, in the Sudan where 500,000. Where are the resolutions? Where are the UN condemnations? Where's the outcry of the civilized world? The victims are indeed in these cases not Jews. And I wish I could tell you it's purely altruism that we have been in the forefront of the efforts on behalf of Bosnia, and indeed it would be reason enough. But we understand that a world that will accept concentration camps for Muslims in the heart of Europe today, or the gassing of innocent Kurds in Iraq today, will accept it for Jews tomorrow. There are no ideological boundaries, there are no geographical differences, no religious or ideological separations, and no political concepts. When indifference to human suffering abounds, there are no differences. We know what it means to face a silent world, a world silent in the face of barbarity. We were reminded again this summer after the bombing in Buenos Aires when 100 people died. 100 people died and it never made the front page of the New York Times. And when the UN weeks afterwards finally decided to introduce a resolution, they refused to include the mention of the fact that the victims were Jews. They wanted to generalize the victims away, as has so often been the case in our history in the past. Jewish blood cannot be cheap, and we will not allow it to be so. And we will make sure that those who were responsible for this act and the killing in Panama and the killings in London, that they will be brought to justice, and those who assist them will be held responsible. The fact that 50% of those killed were not Jews is because they kill indiscriminately, because they're driven by blind hatred. They don't care who the victims are, because the fact is that all of us were the targets. All Jews were the targets, and all Jews were the victims. What I believe has changed in these 50 years is not that the world has changed, but that we have changed. Indifference may remain the hallmark of the international community, but we have shown that we have learned some of the lessons of the past. That is why Judaism puts such emphasis on zechirah, on remembrance, on a sense of history, telling us always that we have to remember. Every parsha we read, every commandment, every holiday is geared not just to a ritual observance, but to remembrance, to be instructive. Because Chazal, our sages, understood that experience was in fact the best teacher. Zechirah is central to all of Jewish life, not because we enjoy dwelling on the tsaros of the past, the tragedies of the past, but because we have to learn the lessons to protect future generations, not just for ourselves. Zechirah, remembrance, gives us this unusual vision, an ability to discern what others don't see, to permeate the chaos of the world and perceive the dangers. That's what it means to be an or lagoyim, a light unto the nations. It's not always a blessing, sometimes it's a curse, because you see things others don't see, and you yell and you scream and you say, look, and they say, we don't see it. It is our job to create a path of light in the darkness of confusion. But the world doesn't want to see. It didn't want to see 50 years ago, and it doesn't want to see today. And too often the West waits to react rather than to act, to prevent and deter. And that is why we had the World Trade Center bombing. That's why we had the invasion of Kuwait, which we could have prevented. And that's why we've had the deaths in Bosnia, which could have been stopped without a single soldier had we acted early enough. The West refused to take the lesson of Israel after the Iraq bombing. It refused to heed the warnings of Israel. It continued to supply Saddam Hussein with all the weapons, with nuclear technology, biological and chemical weapons technology. And he kept proclaiming and declaring to the world what he was going to do, and we continued to turn a blind eye and gave him loan guarantees until the day he invaded Kuwait, and in fact continued even thereafter, and now pay $300 million in debt interest because of his failure to pay on the loan guarantees we gave him. Zechirah reminds us not to get hung up on the events of a particular moment that blinds us to the larger picture, the long-term obligations, the historic realities. It helps us define our responsibility to future generations, not allow the naysayers to put us on a negative path. It's too easy to be negative in the short run, and you pay the price in the long run. We can't allow fear or ignorance or apathy to incapacitate us, to freeze us in the face of challenging causes and demands. When we are unsure of our own beliefs and unable to advocate effectively, we pay the price. After the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Iron Curtain and the Gulf War, we were told that a new world order would emerge. It did not come to fruition in 1994. If anything, what we saw was a further retraction to the old world disorder. Wars of ideology are being replaced by wars of ethnicity, which are no less virulent and no less dangerous. It was easier when we were dealing with a monolithic power like the Soviet Union to understand the danger. How many of us really understand the world we live in and the dangers that exist today, despite the information revolution and the superhighway that enables us to see things even before they happen? And the question to each of us is, how do we react? How many of us know the wars that are taking place throughout the world? Places like Nagorno-Karabakh, which very few people can even find on the map, and yet 6 countries are involved in a hot war with broader implications, regional implications, and even beyond that. As you heard last week, I was in Israel for the Jackson Vanik 20th anniversary commemoration. It reminded me of the incredible struggle, the unique movement that made us a part of history, players in the most glorious revolution of modern times. It reminded us that Soviet Jews did more for us, frankly, than I think we did for them. The Jackson Amendment elevated the status of human rights to a new high. When we see the Pope giving Waldheim an award for human rights, we see how low it has sunk today. We won despite all the odds being against us, opposition of the President and the Secretary of State, of business and commercial interest. Jackson Vanik changed the way we functioned in Washington. Senator Jackson taught us how to talk truth to power. It mobilized the grassroots for political advocacy. The Jewish community began to come to terms with its role in the political process and its power. It was no longer marginal to the political system. 50 years ago, we were being told that Uncle Joe Stalin was an affable ally. We were also told that we could never change the Soviet Union and that Soviet Jews were lost down the memory hole of history. The Soviet Jewry movement, initiated by young Jews here and abroad, spearheaded by Israel and driven by the courage and sacrifices of Soviet Jews, paved the way for Glasnost. They paved the way for Perestroika. They made the Iron Curtain into a Venetian blind, and they made the impossible, not only the improbable, possible. We learned the lessons of the past and made Soviet Jewry the #1 human rights issue of the world. Today, 800,000 Jews are free because of it. And God willing, hundreds of thousands more will follow. But it isn't over yet. We know that the situation in the former Soviet Union is unstable. You know about the rise of antisemitism, and you know about Zhirinovsky. Don't dismiss him. He's not a clown because he throws flower pots at students demonstrating against him. In 1991, he got 6 million votes, 8% of those people who came to the polls. 2.5 years later, he got 25% of the vote, and yesterday announced that he will run for president in 1996. Don't dismiss him. He got more votes than Hitler got in 1930. You know, in the 1920s, after the Russian Revolution, the world was told we were on the verge of a new age of democracy, when it was really a stepping stone to a new age of totalitarianism. No one knows the future of of Russia today. And we have to be prepared for any eventuality. The hardliners have demonstrated their power in the events in Chechnya and on other occasions. Don't believe that the military has been removed from the power structure of the former Soviet Union. The number of Jews has diminished due to immigration and due to other demographic factors. There are only 115,000 school-aged Jewish children left in the Soviet Union, and perhaps a reservoir of 500,000 Jews to come out. We have to make sure that they can come out and be absorbed in dignity. Let my people go was the slogan, but not let my people go to be lost. We must assure that they remain part of the Jewish community, that the opportunity is there for them to lead Jewish lives in Israel here and even in the Soviet Union until they leave. It is a challenge that all of us carry. To have saved them only to lose them is not what all that struggle was for. The implications of the events in Chechnya are so grave, and I don't have time to discuss it. But it has internal implications. It has external implications. It has implications for all of the neighbors, the Dagestans, the Tajikistans, and the other Islamic republics who look again and see, like in Bosnia, that the West turns a blind eye when Muslims are the victims. and a heavy toll will encourage others to pursue the same course. The CIS is unhappy about its borders, and I think in 1995 we are going to see many manifestations within the Soviet Union against the Central Power and by the Central Power against its neighbors. And in East Europe, we see that election after election is bringing back old-time hardline communists back to power. We see old rivalries reemerging. We see antisemitism even where there are no Jews. The greatest danger, of course, is the instability and the political growth of extremist elements. And today they do it in the open. In 1995, we may not see a return to the old system, but reform will be slowed and I think even reversed. And it's not just the dangers in East Europe. In West Europe, we have now seen a study showing there are 450 extremist groups, some today Europe-wide. We see the extremists of the left and right gaining power, and the revulsion and the reaction to the immigration creating greater basis of support for them. And while the Maastricht Treaty may be the path of the future in the eyes of many, what we see is the growth of irredentist movements and a throwback to the Europe of 100 years ago, not of what was supposed to happen in the 21st century. And one of the major factors in this, and what I believe to be one of the major factors on the international scene that will affect world Jewry and the world for many years to come, an issue which I have tried to address for many years, but has fallen on deaf ears. And perhaps the most important development of 1994 was the growing recognition of the danger posed by Islamist fundamentalists. This requires a lecture of its own to do justice, even to outline what I believe will be the dominant factor of international relations in 1995 and for years afterwards. I used to say that this is a problem that engulfs half of the world. It's not true. Today it engulfs the entire world. I only wish I could go through the map with you, because you have to understand the imminence of this danger to every one of us and to all the things that we hold dear, to every interest we have as Americans, as people who care about democracy and freedom, as people who care about Israel. It's hard to get people to understand it because they say we haven't experienced it. Because they don't go and capture governments, they capture people. They start on the most common level with a mosque, which provides a kindergarten and a nursery and a medical clinic and social welfare and educational services. And they gain the allegiance of people. 90% of those who were engaged in the suicide bombings all came through that process, starting in youth. The U.S. officials couldn't understand it. They said, look, it's not a new ism like communism. Indeed, it isn't, because it's far more dangerous. And they say we have to learn to accommodate, just as they said about Saddam Hussein and Khomeini. That's not the way you approach terrorism. They just didn't get it. Thank God today the FBI, the NSC, President Clinton, and others get it. And we will see introduced this year the most comprehensive legislative package, and it will be a priority for 1995 for our community and for all communities to see to it that this package, which will deal with immigration, to stop the free flow of terrorists in and out of our country, to stop the flow of arms and money to these terrorist groups, to see to it that the U.S. is in the forefront of the effort nationally and internationally to stop the recruitment, the training, the arming, and the execution of terrorist acts. We have to internationalize it, as Christopher has promised us, in the G7, in NATO, to see to it that the European nations live up to their responsibilities, because even today they are paying the price. Only then can we deal with the scourge of terrorism, which is spreading rapidly. And I can tell you, when we were in Casablanca, every Arab leader pressed us and said, look, we are the first victims. It is not Islam that is the enemy, and we should be clear. It's those who exploit Islam, who distort it, and who use it for political ends. From China to Morocco, the Uzbeks in China seeking independent status, the wars in Myanmar, Philippines, Indonesia, in Kashmir, in 3 of the 6 former republics of the Soviet Union are Islamic revolutions. In Afghanistan, we paid $3 billion to train tens of thousands of terrorists who now serve Islamic warlords all over the world. India and Pakistan come and court us because they fear Islamic fundamentalism. The wars in Chechnya, in Dagestan, Tajikistan, the fighting, the unrest, will all feed this revolution. in Africa, in Kenya, Nigeria. The warlords in Somalia that we fought were Islamic fundamentalists. Sudan has a fundamentalist government and 12,000 terrorists from 19 countries trained there. And they played a role in the Algerian Revolution. And believe me, the government of Algeria has all but fallen. If it weren't being propped up by France all too late in response to the results of an election, and we see again that elections in the Middle East mean one man, one vote, one time. But the basket cases that we should be paying attention to are not Algeria or the Sudan. It's Egypt and Turkey, the two cornerstones of Western policy in the Middle East. Egypt, which has had its tourism business decimated, a loss of $2 billion. Thousands have been killed. But it's not just the poor. All of the professional societies have been taken over by the Islamic fundamentalists. You know that an Egyptian doctor who visits Israel today loses his medical license. You see that Israel was excluded from the film festival that is taking place, the book festival that is taking place in Cairo this week, and the film festival last week. In the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia announced they arrested 131 people. It's 1,300 to be sure. In Bahrain, there have been daily fights. In Aden, in the streets of Aden, where the fundamentalists are part of the government, there were tank battles. Virtually no part of the Gulf area, with the exception perhaps of Qatar, has been spared the Islamic Revolution. And the Saudis admitted to Peter Tarnoff, the Deputy Secretary of State, when he visited there recently, that in fact they had turned over the education ministry to the fundamentalists. That's all they want. When they want 30% of the vote in Jordan, they ask for one ministry, not defense, not foreign ministry, education, because they're building for the future. I only wish we could have time to go through the rest of it, to understand that Turkey today has 100,000 mosques. But it's not just the Middle East and it's not just Asia, it's Europe today. There are 10 million Muslims in the heart of Europe. And we know that the radicalization of this community is taking place and constantly advancing. The number 2 religion in Belgium is Islam. In Holland, there were 10 mosques a decade ago. There are 1,000 today. In France, there are 4 million Muslims, and you see the rioting in Marseille is Islamic fundamentalist inspired, and the fights over the right to wear veils in the classroom has pitted them against the government. The prime ministers of all these countries, when we meet with them, say, how come you don't understand this danger? And indeed, we didn't. Even after the World Trade Center bombing, we didn't get it. The program Jihad in America and the growing recognition on the part of some American officials have finally changed that. They're beginning to get it. That America is the number 2 source of funding for Islamic terrorist organizations, that they come and traverse this country freely, that they have had operational headquarters in this country and they train and recruit young people on campuses in this country and have set up centers from one part of the country to the other. And the center of this movement, as you all know, is Iran. It is the octopus whose tentacles reach out to the continent by their funding of these groups. And it doesn't matter whether they're Sunni or Shiite, they bridge the differences. And we see increasingly that there is an international coordination between these groups, despite the denials. Iran is no longer a local power, it's a regional superpower. It has been on an intensive campaign since 1987, despite the fact that its economy is in ruins. It has 40% inflation, it has 40% unemployment, it has 1 million babies every 7 months that they can't feed. They spend more on food supports than they get from the oil income. They are behind on $20 billion of debt and running an annual deficit of $7 billion. And the only thing that's propping them up is the greed of Germany and France and their blindness to their own self-interest. As they did with Khomeini, they are continuing today. And they restructured that debt rather than letting the government carry the burden. And they continue to assist them in the hope of the search for some elusive moderation in the Iranian government. Its short-sightedness in 1994 as it was in 1944 and 1934. The seeking of economic gain blinds them and to the myth of moderation which eludes them. I could go through all of the litany of what they have purchased, from submarines to atomic reactors to the deals with North Korea for the No-Dong missile, which gives them a 1,300-kilometer range, which means they can hit any target in Israel without leaving their borders. The missile boats they've just purchased. All of this will paint a picture for you of what Iran's intentions really are. It doesn't look moderate to me. And the other part of the equation, which is going to be very significant in 1995, is Iraq. Iraq was diminished, not defeated. Much of the infrastructure remains. They have 200 to 300 Scud missiles, and we know that much of the technology remains underground intact. You know, there were 20,000 people involved in clandestine nuclear research before the Gulf War in Iraq. How much of that do you think remains? Saddam Hussein, in a speech earlier this past week, said, "Who will fire the 40th Scud on Israel?" No signs of moderation. No signs of moderation when he wiped out the Marsh Arabs in a technological feat that is really quite remarkable. $5 billion in debt to France and Russia blinds them, though, and they try to break the sanctions and lift the sanctions even now. Dual containment of Iran and Iraq must be a priority in 1995 if we are to see the peace process continue, if we are to see to it that the world order is not further endangered. To prevent Iraq from rearming and Iran from expanding its capacity must be a priority, and the United States has to continue in the lead of that effort. And it's very much related to another priority, which is the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. We have seen the arrests of 4 or 5 people in a single month carrying enriched uranium and plutonium out of the former parts of the Soviet Union. People arrested in Bulgaria and Czechoslovakia and Germany and in France and in Switzerland. Today, on the open market for $250 million, you can buy enough uranium for an atomic bomb. Think of this coupled with what the North Koreans are developing, the missile delivery systems, and the missiles that Iran and Syria and Iraq are building, to understand what the danger here is represented. It is not the same as a nuclear Soviet Union. It's a far greater danger because there are far fewer constraints. There is a need for prompt international action as the United States has tried to initiate to halt the spread of nuclear weapons and the nuclear capacity, particularly from the former Soviet Union. One of the most significant developments of 1994 was certainly the progress in the peace process. You cannot understand the peace process without the context of the events I just mentioned, and then only briefly. To understand that the existential dangers to Israel are Iran and Iraq. To understand that they see the growth of Islamic fundamentalism undermining their neighbors. That Israel is not the source of instability, is the lesson the Arabs have learned. If anything, it is a source of stability. I'm not going to go into details of the negotiations. I want to talk about our responsibility, not our policy. I don't know whether this is salam or salami. I don't know whether this represents true peace or just another stage in the Arab war against Israel. But I do know that Israel has said that 12 times in this century they negotiated, 12 times the Jews accepted, 12 times the Arabs rejected. They have always demonstrated their readiness to take unprecedented steps, short of sacrificing its security, for peace. Our job is to see to it that Israel enters the negotiations in strength and achieves security. For us, the ultimate question is, what is the alternative? Is the status quo acceptable? Can we continue to live and have Israel thrive under the conditions that obtained before the peace process? That is the question. I don't know whether Syria will progress in its peace talks, certainly not in the coming months. Perhaps before the end of 95, we will have the outlines of some sort of an agreement. The pressure in Israel will mount if no progress, as we saw in the meeting of Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Syria earlier this month. Phase 2 of the Palestinian Declaration of Principles will be initiated, although in a more limited way. There will be zones created so as to protect Jewish populations with Israeli forces and free the cities of Israeli presence. And an election is possible. It's not yet clear, though, who will benefit. The role of Hamas, the Islamic fundamentalists, who are organized and ready and much more popular than portrayed, could be far more destructive than believed. And to me, the key is what will happen with the next generation. The hatred, the stereotypes, the fears must be addressed because no piece of paper will overcome them. I do briefings for Arab leaders who come to the United States. And recently, I did one for 11 Muslim leaders from 11 Arab countries. And the first question they asked me is, how does the peace process conform to page number 42 of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion? I tell them, to tell you the truth, I haven't read it lately. And I asked, how many of you really believe that the Protocols is a legitimate document? 10 out of the 11. And the same thing is true of every single Arab group I meet. how they have absorbed the stereotypes, the negative stereotypes of Jews that they see in their newspapers and mass media. And why should one be surprised? Why should one be surprised that the motto that we heard in Casablanca, where Arabs and Israelis were finally sitting down and together, was the fear of economic domination by Israel of the Arab world? That Israel's plan was really to take over the economies of all of her neighbors. And there is a danger that we raise Arab expectations too high, and then they can't be met. They all think that the signing of those documents is going to bring them instant aid and instant relief. It's not going to happen. There are tough issues ahead. The issues we've addressed till now are the easy ones. The issues of water and borders, refugees, these are life and death issues. And we haven't even come to them. Those who had hoped to foster democracy, I think they have seen their hopes dashed. We have to see the process, as I said, in a much broader context. The context of the end of the Cold War and the Gulf War and the Iranian Revolution, and I believe the emigration of Soviet Jewry, which brought to the realization of the Arab states that the time bomb had stopped ticking and that time was in Israel's favor with the immigration of hundreds of thousands of Russian Jews. Opponents of the peace process can't blind themselves to the positive changes. The economic revolution, the breaking of Israel's isolation with 146 countries now recognizing it, the value of a peaceful border with Jordan, the new economic tides inside and outside the region are legion today. The opportunities for Israel to develop to assure its economic viability and ability to absorb future immigrants with dignity and provide jobs and housing is almost unlimited. And the proponents of the peace process also have to be honest about the continuing dangers and the deaths. The failure of the Arabs to live up to the promises and commitments that even Egypt, which could set such a good example for future peace agreements, has chosen not to pursue a warm peace, let alone the issue of the Palestinian Authority's compliance, to admit to the uncertainties of the Arab leadership and their ability to contain and their failure to contain terrorism. I saw in Israel last week how much the mood is shifting, and I believe in 1995 we will see that trend continue. Increasing distrust on the part of both sides who want to see results, but may not. The mood shifts from the euphoria of the signing ceremonies to the disillusionment engendered by the terrorism. We recognize that the DOP, the Declaration of Principles, is only a beginning of negotiations, and the really tough talks lie ahead. The agreement with Jordan was indeed different, but it too has to pass tests. And I can tell you Jordanian officials have complained that they haven't seen the benefits. The significance is obvious to all, and having that border quiet removes major obstacles and reduces the leverage against Israel and offers new options for the future negotiations with the Palestinians. But the promises have to be fulfilled. I believe, for one, that it is for the people of Israel and its democratically elected government to make policy that determines the security of its state. Those who will live and, God forbid, die by the results alone have the right to make those decisions. I also believe that all of world Jewry has a right to give expression to their concerns, to their views, in responsible and appropriate ways. It doesn't matter whether you believe not 1 inch or every inch, because neither you or I will draw the maps. And frankly, as long as the Israeli political parties come to America to raise funds, they can't very well reject the right of Americans to express themselves, a practice which I hope and believe will come to an end because it is unhealthy for all. In truth, none of the parties to the negotiations alone, maybe even in combination, can determine the ultimate course of the peace process. They can affect one tract or perhaps several of them, but none of them can affect all of the factors in this complex, very complex issue and process. And in fact, all of the factors are interrelated. Do you know that there are some 90 bilateral, multilateral, intergalactic committees, subcommittees, subcompact committees who are meeting in regard to the peace process? In fact, it has caused a manpower shortage in Israel, I understand. It reflects the complexity of the talks, the details that have to be addressed, the concerns that have to be considered. We have to take into account the role of Iran and Iraq and Islamic fundamentalism that I talked about before, and the danger of economic collapse or the price of oil changing rapidly, or the resurgent Soviet foreign policy, which we have seen taking shape. For those of us living here, it is not a question really of policy, but of responsibility. What is our obligation in this complex and vital process? Too much of what has transpired here, I believe, has entailed language and at times actions that are at best counterproductive, even for the positions being advocated, and certainly for the long-term interests of Israel. Verbal aggression is un-Jewish and unacceptable. Ads comparing Israel to Bosnia, Rwanda, or Lebanon can have long-term detrimental impacts. All of the years we spent declaring that Israel is an ally of the United States, a strategic asset, a vulnerable, a valued partner, and justifying $3 billion in assistance, saying that it brings $30 billion in return in security for the United States. All of this can be undone in the minds of Americans who are all too ready to accept and believe it. It will hurt in the future, perhaps even when there is a different government of Israel. When terms like murderer, traitor, or crybabies are used, when attempts are made to intimidate into silence pro and con views, when vital Israeli and Jewish interests are compromised by overzealous defenders or proponents, when negotiation positions are undermined, or Israeli positions are distorted, giving aid and comfort to her enemies by parties abroad, this has to be unacceptable. Those who are ready to compromise the interests of Israel and those who wish to prevent any compromise alike must be held to account by the community. One last issue in the peace process, and that is Jerusalem. In 1994, we saw the challenge to Jerusalem's status mounted. It is no longer a final status issue. The true jihad, holy war for Jerusalem, is on now. The battle for its sanctity, for its security, for freedom of religion to all and its uniqueness to us. The New York Times last week spoke of the competing claims to Jerusalem. They are not competing claims. No time in history did the Arabs ever try to make Jerusalem its capital, and never was Jerusalem the capital of any Arab state. Jerusalem is mentioned 700 times in the Jewish Bible. It's not mentioned once in the Quran, nor did Muhammad ever step once into Jerusalem, except in later interpretations of his night flight. It never occupied a special place for the Muslims until recent times. And this is not to deny their rights or their freedom of religion or the need to protect them. Do you know that the Arab population in Jerusalem has doubled since 1967, proportionally a much greater growth in the Jewish community? I believe in 1995 will be the year when the decision is made to put the embassy of the United States in Jerusalem at a date certain. It is no longer to be left for the final status negotiations. We have to follow Prime Minister Rabin's assertion that Jerusalem is open religiously and closed politically. On this, we have a united community, and we have a great opportunity with Jerusalem 3000, the celebration in 1996 of the 3000th anniversary of King David's founding of Jerusalem as the eternal Jewish capital, an opportunity to educate the world that Jerusalem is the eternal capital of Israel and only of Israel, and respect for all and protecting the religious freedom for all. The Talmud says, Omer Yerushalayim lo Omar Klum, somebody who simply said Jerusalem hasn't said anything. I never understood what it meant. What it means is those who simply say Lashana Abba Yerushalayim next year in Jerusalem at the end of the Seder or at the end of the Yom Kippur davening, but do nothing about it throughout the year, then you haven't said anything. Our words have to be matched by our deeds. The opposition is today proclaiming throughout the world its claim to Jerusalem. It is up to us. And in this, I believe we have an equal stake because Jerusalem belongs to all of us. Jerusalem is ours. Jerusalem's history is our history. Its trials and tribulations are our trials and tribulations. Its glory is our glory. Jerusalem is the heart of Zion, and Zion is the heart of Jerusalem. And our obligation is today to proclaim it to the world so that there be no misunderstanding. When King David founded Jerusalem 3,000 years ago to be the eternal capital, he didn't do it just so that a hotel would carry his name. He did it so that the Jewish people will remember forever, if I forsake thee, O Jerusalem. It doesn't say if I forsake East Jerusalem or West Jerusalem or North Jerusalem or South Jerusalem. It says Jerusalem. And that is our obligation today. The next topic is anti-Semitism, one that I can deal with very quickly. And much has been said of late, and I will not go into my notes on this because it would take too much time. But much has been said of late that it would appear that anti-Semitism is no longer relevant, that it's a vestige of the past. Nothing could be further from the truth. I suggest those who believe it ride the subway one day with a yarmulke on, or check the campuses across the country. We have become too complacent about it sometimes. We have seen how on the campuses of America, there is virtually none that hasn't experienced an anti-Semitic incident, a physical attack on a Jewish institution or Jewish individual, the teaching of anti-Semitic diatribes and trash, and the justification of it by faculty and administrations. We have seen reported acts of anti-Semitism from one coast to the other, and often with very weak responses, even justifying the publication of Holocaust revisionist ads as freedom of speech. And it should be a great concern to all of us that the next generation finds this an acceptable way to give expression to its frustrations, or that academic freedom somehow is used as a cover for anti-Jewish activities. Sometimes it seems that we make this serious phenomenon seem meaningless. We will pay a price for it if we do. On the other hand, we make it frivolous when we use the accusation and label people as anti-Semites too freely. There are enough real anti-Semites. We don't have to create them. We have to create an objective balance that not every comment that offends us requires an all-out response, but we must be prepared to act successfully when appropriate. And even if we don't win, as in the Jeffries case, it doesn't mean it wasn't the right thing to do. It was. And the message has to be gotten out that anti-Semitism, like racism and bigotry of all forms, will not be tolerated. I want to raise in particular a caution when it comes to our dealings with the so-called religious or Christian right, two very bad terms. This is not a monolithic camp, and we have to differentiate between those who have views that we may not agree with and those whose behavior is unacceptable. We have to isolate the bad, not condemn with a broad brush. One can't compare Jack Kemper or Gene Kirkpatrick even with a Pat Buchanan or a Pat Robertson. We have to understand that we can't write off 60 million Americans. They have the same rights we do for political expression and political involvement. It's the misuse of the political system that we have to guard against. There are areas where many agree, where we may agree, and others we will certainly be on diametrically opposite sides. But the same was true in regard to the left. With them, we confronted them when they were wrong and vital interests were at stake, and we worked together where we agreed. We have to stop demonizing the right, religious or political, and to approach it more intelligently, because we will end up marginalizing ourselves. I participated in a meeting in Washington in the Senate between leaders of the religious right and leaders of the Jewish community that was widely reported in the press. And it was really a remarkable gathering, not because of what was achieved, but because of the sensitizing that took place. And that Jerry Falwell went on national radio, on NPR no less, and declared that he did not understand sometimes the words he used, how hurtful and harmful, and how exclusionary they were. And at the same time, he wants the Jewish community to understand how painful it is for him to be accused of being an anti-Semite. We have seen the political pendulum swing in 1994. It has swung widely in response to excesses of the past. We have seen a new Congress come in, not in an evolutionary way, but a revolutionary way. More than 50% of the Congress has changed in the last 3 years. There is no reason for panic, though. A periodic shakeup in Washington sometimes can be healthy, and I have no doubt that the pendulum will ultimately swing back as the new leaders are put to the test. Responsibility tempers extremism when they have to deal with reality and not ideology. And the fact is, amongst the new congressmen, 90% issued pro-Israel position papers. In 1992, everyone said foreign aid would be dead with the election of 114 new members who ran on an anti-foreign aid platform. Do you know that 80% of them voted for the foreign aid bill? 3 times those they replaced? And we had the biggest margin ever this past year. The U.S.-Israel relationship is deeply rooted in bipartisan support, and in fact, many of those who become chairman of committees are an improvement for us. Israeli aid is safe, but we shouldn't take it for granted. The cuts that are going to take place will ultimately hit this as well. What will be affected this year is aid for the peace process, aid for Jordan even, the debt forgiveness they'll get, but not the rest, and what will happen when the PLO compliance test comes up in June and further funding for the Palestinian Authority is in question. The domestic agenda, on the other hand, I think will be impacted far greater, especially with the danger of a balanced budget amendment and perhaps with prayer and other issues coming to the fore. The American people want relief from the burdens. They want a reassertion of values, but not at any price. The election showed us, however, how important it is for the Jewish community to be involved politically, how important every vote is. When Sam Gadenson, the son of Holocaust survivors, is elected by 4 votes, it tells us how important each vote is, how much each of us counts in the political process, how much each of us can have a say, how important it is for the Jewish community in this year before a presidential election to engage in voter registration. Don't condemn them for their success in mobilizing. Mimic them. Do the same. We have to do voter education so that people understand 50% of young Jews are not registered and don't vote. It is a very important statement about their commitment to democracy. And if you're not involved in democracy, you can't decry the results. The fact is that we have the most friendly administration for Israel and for Jewish causes that perhaps we ever had. I think Bill Clinton is somebody who deeply believes in Israel and is deeply linked to Jewish interests and causes. There are problems with the Clinton administration, and we have to make sure that we don't isolate ourselves. We want all the parties to compete for our support, and we should reach out for theirs. The fact is that Newt Gingrich and others, D'Amato and Packwood, have certainly been in the forefront of defending Israel, Soviet Jewry, and other issues over the years. We will disagree with them, but we have to create a climate of respect, of mutual respect, a new political climate, that the organizations of the Jewish community will protect our vital interests by thoughtful advocacy of what we are for, not simply what we are against. Perhaps it's time to revisit issues like school vouchers and quotas and put forward positive alternatives that assert our values and make us relevant. It's time to look at the past positions. Just because they worked in the past, it doesn't mean they are appropriate anymore. It's time for Jews also to challenge the political correctness ideology that has become so dominant on many American campuses, defining deviancy down as Pat Moynihan put it. But I see it in its specific dangers for us as distorted values are inculcated and accepted by the next generation. We have to pursue legislation that will encourage Jewish and general family life and provide relief for daycare and elder care. I don't believe that the communal institutions will be able to pick up the slack of the budget cuts at the state and national levels. We also have to begin to address the future of Jewish life in urban America, a subject that requires a great deal of consideration. We can't separate security as Jews from violence in our society. We cannot look at the increasing population shifts, the movement from ethnic to color differentiations, to the aging infrastructures and social problems, when we are largely an urban population, a growing poor population, the Jewish poor, the 1/4 to 1/3 of the community who qualify as near poor, many of them new poor, the increasing population of the old, those over 85, and the needs that they will put on our community. There is an urgency for us to put legislative initiatives as a priority. We also have to see to it that cemeteries here and abroad are protected. This is the test of the civilization, of the dignity of any generation. The truth is, we tend not to like to look inward. It's always easier to talk about saving Soviet Jews or Yemeni Jews than our own children. It's somehow less comfortable when you have to deal with the problems that are so close to home. This is the hot topic on the lecture circuit now: Jewish identity and Jewish continuity. You know that no generation, it said, is judged in its time. It's judged in the 3rd generation. I hope that I can vindicate my grandfather's sacrifices as my children will my father's and my mother's. But the test for us will be what our children and their children are. The test for American Jewry is what 2 generations from now will be like. Too often, this term of Jewish continuity is used as a catchphrase, a slogan almost devoid of substance. The problem is that many use it not knowing enough to give it substance and content. Jewish continuity is not an end, it is a means to an end. It defines our aspirations and our hopes for ourselves and future generations. A case could be made that what young Jews today are doing is, in fact, Jewish continuity, for it is a continuation of what their parents showed them and the directions that they pursued. Perhaps not as many intermarried because they couldn't. The loss of Jewish identity is the natural outcome of the melting pot theories that sought to take the Jew out of American Jewry and now find it so hard to put it back. Their success was their failure. What was positive for the Jew was negative for the Jews. And the Jews benefited at the expense of their Jewishness. The sociologist Robert Merton wrote of the third generation return. If the third generation returns, the message is the fourth will be lost. The Lubavitcher Rebbe once told on the said a commentary about the four sons in the Haggadah. He says the wise son, is the one who came from Europe, who knew what a Jewish life was about. The Russia, the rebellious son, was the one who rebelled against all of these traditions, the old world habits, the old world practices. The She'enu Dea Lisho, the one who doesn't know what to ask, is the next generation. He remembered his Jewish grandparents. He remembered certain things, but he didn't know enough to ask about it. And the last is the Tam, the simple one, who didn't even remember Jewish grandparents. He doesn't even know what it's all about. And he said, and then there is the fifth son, the one who doesn't show up at all. When we are instructed, uvacharta v'chaim, that we should choose life, it doesn't say choose life for yourself. It says, liman tichya ata v'zarecha. The Bible says when you choose life, you do it for your children, not only for yourself. Because we are judged by what happens to future generations. We have to get them when they're young. The studies show that children and young people between 16 and 22 make up the decisions, the kind of ideology, the life, the way of life and practices that they will pursue. And it is also important what we do with them from the 0 to 16. I think we have to do much more in the high school outreach to understand that these are the formative years. Because if we lose them then, by the time they come to the campus, it's too late. Young Jews and older Jews, in fact, are searching. They are looking for the significance to them, to the meaning to them. They want the real thing. They want real Jewish content. They want to be inspired with Jewish experience, Jewish values, Jewish heroes. And in this regard, I must say that the 92nd Street Y is really on the cutting edge, and we are indebted to them. The soaring intermarriage rate is a symptom, and there is no instant solution. We have to make young Jews feel important in Jewish life, and Jewish life important to them. We have to explain to them why they are significant. When only 20% of American young Jews declare themselves opposed to intermarriage, it underscores that this is a fundamental failure on our part. We have to study what the missionaries do and why they have succeeded, and you will understand where we have failed. The love, the joy, the outreach that they bring to it. We have to reach in and reach out to open our hearts, our homes, our communities, our synagogues. We have to go after the voluntary Maranos of this generation. Those who are isolated or alienated, those who are hidden or ignorant. But they are not lost. We have to tell them not only of the tsaras, but of the joys and the victories and the celebration, the positive aspects of Judaism, not just the negatives. We have to tell them about the Holocaust, but also about Yom Ha'atzmaut, Israel Independence Day. Aliyah is not a running away, but the fulfillment of the highest spiritual calling. We have to create Jewish role models. It is no wonder that Jewish ethnotherapy studies show that young Jews have negative self-images. Well, if we give them Bo Derek and Robert Redford as the models to measure themselves by, they're never going to do well. We have to give them Jewish role models, Jewish heroes, to show them a Joe Lieberman, who the papers in Connecticut on the front page headline said, Lieberman misses convention because of Sabbath observance. And the story that he tells about what he does on Shabbos, no apologies. And the respect that he has earned amongst his colleagues. We have to show him a Devorah Waxman, who stood up and said, despite the loss of her son, that the ultimate goal was Jewish unity, bringing people together, the personal sacrifice that she made, the role model that she is. We have to give Jewish children Jewish heroes. And we have to do it now. And we cannot allow the media to continue to distort Jewish life, Judaism, and in particular, Jewish women. Between the Japs and the Jewish mother portrayals on TV, why would a Jewish male marry a Jewess? We can't use Aunt Jemima images anymore. Why do we allow negative stereotyping of Jewish women? We cannot allow them and tolerate the denigration of Jews and Judaism. In fact, it is an essential part, perhaps, of the remedy for us to begin to use the channels of mass communications. One of the things the Arabs always say to me is, look, we know you control the television stations and you control the media. I only wish it were true. We have to learn to get out of the 18th century when it comes to the media, and we have to use the electronic highways to reach those who are watching it. In fact, right now, I'd be happy with an electronic subway. We are so far behind. Perhaps the money we spend yearly on caterers would enable us to buy our own network already. Our resources in this area are so limited and so primitive. To engage the major battlefield, when we worry about the missionaries and all of them with their satellite networks, this is where the battleground for the minds of young Jews is taking place. And I commend those communities who have finally come to terms and established these special funds for the Jewish future, for Jewish youth, to provide for Jewish experience and Israel experiences. But we also have to open our schools and our synagogues to hold them open every night, to have teachers available so young people and old people can come in and study and learn. We have to review all of the curricula for their relevance. We have to see if our educational systems really meet the needs of today and tomorrow. We have to see to it that a young student on a campus, if he wants a meal on a Yontif, will have a place to go to. When he wants a ticket for a Rosh Hashanah service, doesn't have to be told that it costs $250 and he's barred from attending. We have to reach out today if we're truly concerned about tomorrow. I have one last topic, and I'm talking as absolutely fast as I can. I see they're still catching up in the last rows, or catching up to that last... And that's the Israel-diaspora relation. It's a subject about which I delivered a very long address, and I'm not going to do it now. We cannot afford a disconnect in the Jewish family. We are not equal partners with Israel. We are a voluntary community. They are a nation with an army and a government. We don't risk our lives for a Jewish state and give 50% of our income. But the assertions that deny legitimacy to the diaspora are equally inappropriate. Perhaps the questions that are being raised now were a luxury in years when Israel was facing more dire survival battles, and now have come to the fore, and it forces us to face these difficult issues about its future and our future. So I think we have to change the relationship from one of patronizing of supporter and supported to one of welfare relationship to one that respects the mutuality of our commitments and of our concerns. The rules of engagement between Israel and diaspora Jewry on this issue have to be made clear. They can't change because governments change or because particular policies change. You can't ask American Jews to be involved in the eternal discussions and then demand of them support. You can't ask American Jews to come to aid them on policy decisions, but deny the right to those who disagree. You can't have it both ways. The language we use in talking about diaspora as being inferior, denying legitimacy, these are harmful and hurtful terms. Each becomes more defensive when they seem to be attacked, and that denigrates the value of the exchange. We have to be ready, each side, to respond when outrageous comments are made. We have to sensitize leaders and followers alike to our common fate and destiny. I remember one of the most meaningful exchanges I ever had with Israeli officials when I addressed the consul generals, and one of them got up and expressed in most painful terms his outrage that American Jews each year hold functions and celebrations on Yom HaZikaron, Israel Memorial Day. And believe me, since then, I invite all of our people to the Yom HaZikaron, and I attend myself. We have to begin to recognize each other's needs and each other's sensitivities and the mutuality of our destiny. To recognize each other's strengths and to recognize that the source of our common strength is our unity. We have to learn from each other and help each other, or both will fail. The bridges need anchors at both ends, and they have to be solid anchors to withstand the inevitable tests and storms and even the earthquakes that occur. Israelis like to talk about American Jewry's problems of intermarriage, but don't like to face the problem of Jewish identity of Israeli youth. The world is becoming more open to Israelis, which means that Israelis will face the same dangers of assimilation and acculturation that American Jews faced earlier. And the same is true of American Jews. They want Israel to save our children by sending them there for a 2 or 3 week experience on a trip. Won't work if they weren't Jews before they left. Neither of us wants to admit our failures. In November, many Israelis who had written us off were reminded of the political importance of American Jews once again. Israel is still central to Jewish life and for the Jewish diaspora. And it will be the center of the Jewish population, the majority of the Jewish population in the years ahead. We have to work together. We cannot have a de-Judaized Israel, void of a Jewish identity, where Yad Vashem and Masada are not of special importance. It will lose its specialness and even its reasons for existence. Israelis are in fact more traditional than we tend to believe. 3/4 of them believe that they share the fate of world Jewry. And a majority, an overwhelming majority, light candles or make kiddush and celebrate holidays, even if they are selective in their observance. They still feel connected and connected to us. We have to make sure that that is enhanced. Much has been said about Jewish organizations, and I'm going to skip that. I just want to say one thing. Indeed, there is need for a reassessment, but the system is a lot more successful than people have believed and that we give credit. The whole world marvels at our system, at what we have accomplished, except the Jews. We need thoughtful reassessment, not devastation. It's easy to knock, but remember we're the envy of all. And just to propose other solutions, Beit Yisrael, whatever, to supplant one mechanism with another, it's not a question of structure, but of results. I want to conclude after outlining to you the issues that I believe will be primary in this coming year and in this past year. When Jews opened the newspapers 50 years ago, the headline they read, and these are the exact headlines, Nazis report 5 million Jews liquidated. It was disclosed in Bern, Switzerland this week, the arrival of German papers containing an official survey of Jewish populated areas in German-dominated Europe. And by the actions to present, 5 million Jews have been eliminated, and there are still others to be dealt with, and cites Hungary in particular. The other headline said that the fate of the Jews of Greece has been determined as it is found out that they were amongst the more than 1 million Jews who died in Majdanek. Only a few Jews found in the ruins of Warsaw by Red Army, Lublin broadcast reports. Those were the headlines people read 50 years ago. It isn't that they didn't know, they didn't want to know. Today, you know everything. There is no cloak of ignorance to hide your shame. You know everything. But the fortunate thing is that our generation doesn't read about the decimation of Jewish communities. We read about the redemption of Jewish communities. We read about the saving of Soviet Jews, of Ethiopian Jews. The first time in blacks taken out of Africa to free them and not to enslave them. All of the Jews of Syria who wanted to leave have left. All the Jews of Yemen will be out by the end of this year. We are seeing the fulfillment of biblical prophecy. We're seeing the ingathering of the exiles. We are the generation that has been blessed to see the miracles. In this Parsha, Yisro, Moses' non-Jewish father-in-law has to say to the Jewish people who are complaining about the water and the neighborhood and all the conditions, and he says to them, Baruch Hashem asher hitzil eschem. Thank God who has saved you. Thank God for the miracles. And the commentators say this was an embarrassment to the Jews. And they said, why? Didn't the Jews just praise God when they crossed the Red Sea? They sang, Oz Yashir, we sang praise to God. And he said, no, it's very easy when the obvious miracles take place. Yisro was telling them, remember the daily miracles. The miracles you take for granted, the miracles you're oblivious to, you're ignorant of. Those are the miracles you have to rise above. Our natural tendencies to see each day that ours is the most blessed generation in modern times. We are the generation that has been given the right and the ability to affect our fate because we have an independent Jewish state, because we have an America that has given us the obligation and the right and the responsibility to determine our fate, to have a say in what happens to us. And sometimes I think we don't want that responsibility. Maybe it's been inbred in our genes after hundreds of years of living at the sufferance of others. Well, you have no choice. American democracy demands involvement. It demands that you be part of the system. It demands that if you want to protect the rights you enjoy and live up to the responsibilities that we all have. We say in the Psalms, Oz Yomru Bagayim, that the nations of the world will proclaim, if God would only do for us what he has done for them, the Jews, Hayinu Samechem, we would rejoice. What does it mean? They want pogroms, they want holocausts. What does he mean, what God has done for us? The answer is that the nations of the world proclaim today, look what God has done for the Jews. This little country, whose name hardly fits on a map, is a world power. Tell anybody that Israel is really 5 million people. Show them how small Israel is. Do you think they believe it's Rhode Island? This little country that exports vodka to the Ukraine and tulips to Holland. This country that's the role model for the third world. You know that there are tens of millions of people from Bolivia to Burma, from Mexico to Indonesia, who today proclaim themselves to be Jews without any historical antecedent. Because they say if you want to be free in Africa, you have to be a Jew. If you want to be free in Russia, you have to be a Jew. The only miracles in the world are happening to the Jews. And the only ones who don't know it are the Jews. We are one people with one destiny. And just as we read in this week's Torah reading, that we stood at Sinai, Vayichan Sham, it said, Ki ish echad b'lev echad, like one person with one heart. All of us will share in the fruits of our common labor, or we will pay the price for our divisiveness. We have one faith, a covenant of fate and a covenant of destiny, as Rabbi Soloveitchik described it. And they come together as we work to assure that the morashah, the heritage, a heritage as opposed to an inheritance, because inheritance you get imposed upon you. A heritage, which is what the Torah and Israel are described as in the Bible, is something that is given to you to protect for future generations, to enhance, and to make sure that they will be able to accept it. We have to protect that inheritance and that heritage. The future will judge us. And future generations will look back just as we judge a generation of 50 years ago and ask, what did they do? They will look back and ask, what did we do? And I believe if we are truly a generation that has learned the lessons of the past, a generation that has zechirah, that is remembering, has remembrance, a generation that understands its responsibilities to the future, our obligations for tikkun olam, for making this a better world, that the world we leave behind will be a safer and more secure world. There's a country song that says you got to stand for something or you'll fall for anything. The credibility of our positions and the justice of our cause and the righteousness of our deeds will bring us success. In this 50th year after the Holocaust, we remember that we can't wait for the world to change. We have to change it. Thank you. Thank you. It was worth staying up those 3 nights. I'm going to take some questions. It reminds me of the story. Senator Hoenlein, now I have time to tell you the story. Senator Hoenlein, when you remember from the Judiciary Committee from Alabama, tells stories about Notai Hawkins, who was a country bumpkin lawyer. And he was invited for the first time to a bar association meeting in Atlanta. And it said, and he was invited there, and it was his first time, and he brought his wife, and she retired for the evening, so he wanted to go out and enjoy what the big city had to offer, and of course became inebriated and tried then to sneak back into the room without his wife discovering it. So he fumbled with the key and got into the room, and as he walked in, he wobbled and he tripped over the lamp, and it came crashing down on him, and there he was sprawled on the floor with the lamp over him, and his wife came out glaring at him and saying, "Well, what do you have to say for yourself?" He said, "I have no prepared text, but I'm ready to take questions from the floor." So, okay, here are the questions. Who do you think the future leaders of American Jewry, who should they be? You know, I have a life after this meeting, you know that this is... I think that the future leaders of American Jewry are going to be those who understand what it means to be a Jew, first and foremost. I think it will be people who understand, people who are positioned, people who understand getting on the board of a museum is not as important as getting on the board of a Jewish day school, who understand the importance of being involved as Jews for the Jewish future, to understand the rewards and the satisfaction. Can you imagine what it meant to stand last week in Jerusalem and see all of these scores of former prisoners of conscience, former refuseniks? Is there any compensation that a person could get that is greater than that? And a Jewish leader is one who understands that, who gets that sipuk nefesh, that satisfaction. The truth is that our community has been blessed with many great leaders. We don't have the great man theory anymore like the Stephen Wises. That era passed. Today it is the community that acts. And in many respects, it's more healthy. We have spokesmen and spokeswomen. We have people of all walks of life who rise to positions of importance. But it is not the individual that counts. You know, the miracles that are made possible in Jewish history are not made by the people whose names appear in lights. When we celebrated Hanukkah, you know that nowhere in the literature does it say who found the one vial of oil that made the miracle of Hanukkah possible. Because the people who make miracles possible are the unsung heroes. It's you. All of the revelry of the world about Jewish power. If I would start telling you all the heads of state who come and visit us at the President's Conference, from countries you never even heard of. I mean, I didn't even know they were countries, and they asked to meet with us. In 1 week, we had 13 heads of state during the General Assembly session, not one at our request. I can tell you the Foreign Minister of China, and he invited us to the embassy and gave us a delicious glatt kosher meal. And I said to him, is this to pay back all the Jews in New York who go to Chinese restaurants? That's right. He didn't get it either. The whole world marvels at what we have. But we're ashamed of it for some reason. We're afraid of it. Nothing to be afraid of. We should be proud. This is the most sacred possession we have. It's what we bring to the equation of Arivut, of responsibility for one another. We don't have an army. We don't bring tanks and airplanes. We bring political power, in addition to our dollars and our concerns. But this country has given us something that is so sacred and so holy. And you know why we count? It's true we have disproportionate influence. Because we care. Most Americans just don't care. And it's the squeaky wheel theory. When congressmen have to read 7,000 pieces of legislation a year, those who can read can't read them all. So they react to those they hear about and to those they hear. You know, I remember a congressman in Mississippi who once said, the second most important constituency I have are Jews. We said, what are you talking about? Huh? You have 506,000 people. He said, 97% are black. 3% are Baptists, white Baptists. So he said, so what about the Jews? He said, there are 100 of them, but they're the doctors and the lawyers and the barbershop. And if I don't do the right thing with Israel, I never hear the end of it. That's what a Jewish leader is. Someone who's willing to stand up with Jewish pride and Jewish goals, not because of ego, even though that's healthy too, but because he understands the responsibility to Jewish destiny. What is the appropriate response to Farrakhan? Oh, and these days, that's a tough question to answer. I'm not going to comment on Shabaz's response, but I will say that I believe that that anti-Semitism is a cancer. And you don't get a cancer go unchecked. But you also know that every sore doesn't require an operation. I believe that we have a responsibility to hold, particularly true in terms of campuses, to hold the administrations responsible, and we have someone here who has been a hero, Edith Everett, in terms of the city college and city university system, in speaking out, in setting a tone. The students have to know it. They can't believe that this is acceptable. They can't believe that Farrakhan's words are a legitimate expression. We wouldn't tolerate it from anyone else, and we're not going to tolerate it when it comes to the Jews. And I think that the responsibility on the part of all of us, it's not just the responsibility of the students. They can't carry the burden alone. We have to help them. And just as we have to increase our programs on the campuses for students, we have to help the students stand up on their campuses. I can't tell you, when I travel around the country, how many times students come to me and tell me how isolated they feel, how they will tell me about an anti-Semitic incident and they didn't even know how to go to the police, and how they didn't have a link to the community. We have to use young leadership groups, should work with the federations and the campuses. They're still young enough to be able to relate, go back to their campuses and serve as a liaison to the community, to see to it that we keep these kids involved and see to it that they're not endangered or intimidated on their campuses. Farrakhan doesn't scare me. I think we have a right and responsibility to see to it that government funds don't go to him, but he has a right to organize patrols and do everything on a volunteer basis as everyone else does. We have a responsibility to see to it that they do not engage in public forums, in anti-Semitism, in Jew baiting and Jew hatred, and that's what he does. Your support of the Israeli-Palestinian Accord has been widely perceived as less than ardent. Why? I don't know why. I'm not sure. I understand the question, and it's a valid question. There have been reports in the press which were really misreports. I have a lot of questions and a lot of concerns and a lot of fears about the peace process. I think everyone does, and I think they're legitimate. Anybody who remembers Israel's wars has every reason to be concerned. I have yet to see that Arafat proves himself to be a worthy partner for peace. I have to see it, that they are willing to make the sacrifices that he has to declare whether he wants peace with Hamas or peace with Israel. I also believe that it's a decision that doesn't rest with me, but rests with the government of Israel and the people of Israel as to what they pursue when it comes to their security. My job is to see to it that there are no pressures brought to them to make decisions that they do not feel comfortable with, that they are forced to make sacrifices that they do not feel comfortable with, or don't represent the views and their assessments of their security. I have been very supportive of the Jordanian-Israeli peace accords, and we have played a role and I accompanied the president when he went for the Jordanian signing, and I participated in the signings at the White House. I will admit to you that I had very mixed feelings watching Arafat march onto the White House lawn. And I think it is still to be proven that this accord will work. But we have to give it the time for it to work out. There's not going to be any instant solutions. Nobody cared about Gaza. Everybody wanted to get rid of it. We're very happy to see Arafat as the mayor or even the governor of Gaza. The question will come is what happens when they start pulling out of Jenin, of Ramallah, of Hebron even, of Beit Lechem in the coming months. And I will tell you that I asked Prime Minister Rabin all of these questions the very day that Peres came back from Oslo. Lester Pollock and I were the first people to be briefed on the peace on the accords. The very morning, in fact, that he flew back. And I asked Rabin all of the questions. Why he wanted to save Arafat when he was being destroyed, why he wanted to resurrect the PLO, why he did this, all of the decisions. And he answered every one of them. But he said the bottom line is, what is the alternative? I don't have a better alternative. And therefore, I have an obligation to support what is and to make it possible for Israel to pursue what it believes to be its best, the best agreement possible for it. Why doesn't the Jewish leadership in Washington fight to continue to grant Jews from the ex-USSR a status of political refugee? Because they come out on Israeli papers, Israel is democracy, they're not refugees. In your honest opinion, putting aside what this audience wants to hear, how much of a Jewish community will there be in this country in 20 years, and what will it look like? Well, if I knew what this audience wants to hear, I would tell them, but it's a very good question. What will this community be like? Well, all of the assessments of the sociologists, for whom I don't have that much respect, but all of the assessments of the sociologists would lead one to the conclusion that we will be a smaller, perhaps much smaller community. I think a more religious community by and large, as not only because the Orthodox have a larger birth rate, but that will not affect the whole thing. I believe that the trend in the Jewish community will be back to more ritual, more practice, more identification with Judaism. I see it amongst young people all across the country, and I believe that there can be a real return to Judaism. The reservoir of immigration is not that great. It's not going to compensate anymore for our losses. We're not going to have mass imported people to the Israel or to the United States. We have to deal with the populations that we have. And so I believe that the Jewish community has got to begin, and that's why I raised the issue of the urban areas. We can no longer afford to have the flight from communities, the loss of tens of millions of dollars every year in investments in our communities as we abandon synagogues and institutions. We have to see to it that we help communities to stabilize, that Jews can remain, that we don't abandon the most frail, the most elderly, the sick, and the others into communities as everybody else who is able to leaves. We have to see to it that these communities are able to remain vibrant and vital, and that means we have to have an urban policy of the Jewish community. It means we have to begin to assess what our interests are. How do we meet the need of the 20% of the Jewish poor? How do we see to it that the people who want a Jewish education can get a Jewish education whether they can afford it or not? How do we see to it that those who feel unwelcome are made welcome? Those who feel insecure are made to feel safe? That's the challenge for our community. And the answer to that challenge will determine what our community will look like. If we are a community that will begin to face up and reorder the priorities and say, this is where we have to put our money, that we have to start looking at our youth and determining how it is that we are going to keep them, how we're going to make them Jews, it means that we are going to have to change how we live. It means that there will be painful decisions have to be made, and agencies will have to be closed, and programs will have to be ended in order to find the resources. I, for one, believe that there is plenty of money in the Jewish community to do everything. We have to teach people how to give and what to give for. We have to make giving more meaningful. We have to make people feel why it is significant. I participated in a Rockefeller Brothers fund study that showed that young Jews don't want to know what they get out of it. They want to know what it means to me. They want to know, what does their money do? Why is it significant? What do we accomplish with it? And we have not showed them that. And more philanthropy is moving, if you see the foundations and you see the activities, to be direct. I hope that as a result of some of the foresighted activities of a few individuals and others in these outreach programs and in the new enterprises that are being initiated, Cage and others, who are going to help revolutionize Jewish education, to create a smorgasbord of Jewish life so that everybody can look at it and say, this is my way, this is something I can relate to. What we need to is bring them closer. It's not a question of how we bring them closer. It's once they are closer, they'll begin to absorb more and become integrated into the community again. I believe that young Jews want to come back. We have to help show them the way. We have to make it easier for them. Too often we make it more difficult, not easier. What is your reaction to the transfer of Jews from their homes in Judea and Gaza, Samaria and Gaza? I do not know of the transfer of any Jews. I'm totally opposed to it. I think Jews have a right to live anywhere in Judea, Samaria, Gaza, just as they live in Paris, France, in Washington, and in Rome, etc. They have to make a decision. The question of security and the question of the ability of a government to protect them and the conditions under which they live is something that will be determined. But I think, and I've spoken to Rabin and to Peres only last week about it, and they assured me again, no settlements are being uprooted. We've seen Netzarim, which is guarded by a couple hundred people, and it's only 15 families. It is an important statement. It should be there. I believe that Jews have a right to live, just as Arabs live in Israel. Jews have a right to live in ancient parts of Israel and traditional parts of Israel, greater Israel, and just as I think Jews should be able to live in Amman if they want to, or in Saudi Arabia if they want to, which they can't, and any of the other Arab countries. I hope that they will all live in Israel. This is a very important issue. Someone else asked a question here. I see the next question. How is it possible for Jews to be moved from the West Bank? Is this not ethnic cleansing? This is part of the language problem that I think we have to engage in, that we have to be careful about. Ethnic cleansing is a very strong term. It has implications that are very grave. And I don't believe that any government of Israel is prepared to engage in ethnic cleansing. There may be individuals who make statements to that effect and whose statements are equally intolerable, including the Prime Minister at times demonstrates insensitivity that is unacceptable. And I think that the Jewish community has made it clear that this is not the kind of language that we should be using. I do think, on the other hand, you have every right, just as you support and must support the UJA Federation and its agencies, if you feel you want to give additional dollars and support the people who are living in the territories, you have every right to do so and should do so. You have every right to speak out and to say you believe that people have a right to live there. And the most important way you can do that is going there and living there and having the right to vote in and out the governments of Israel if you don't like them, and having a right to have a say in the defense and security of Israel. And as long as you're here, you have freedom of speech, you have freedom of expression, but you also have to recognize your responsibilities and the limits on those freedoms. We have to support Israel. We have to see to it that Israel's military needs are met. We have to see to it that its security needs are met. And we hope one day, God willing, Israel will be economically independent. But the interdependence will remain. We are one people and one fate. And when one part of that Jewish body is ill or is hurting, all of us are hurting. When one part is endangered, all of us are endangered. That is why the world doesn't understand when we saved Soviet Jews or Ethiopian Jews. They see it as a conspiracy because there's no other explanation. They have to go to the prodigals of the elders of Zion. They have to find some mystical reason. Why would Jews care about somebody they don't know, they have no relationship to? Why do we care so much about Israel? It's a conspiracy of love. And we also have to show that it's a conspiracy of tolerance. Tolerance for one another, tolerance for the mistakes that we all make, and a right to correct those mistakes and to express ourselves on them in the proper way and in a way that does not hurt long-term interests or even short-term interests. Because all of us will share the same fate. And the decisions we make today, I think, will affect the destiny of Jews for many years to come. I believe that 1995, as 1994, are going to be very critical years in the future of the Jewish people. Every day decisions are being made. You know, when I said before, V'charta v'chaim, it says to choose life. When do we get to choose life? I mean, somebody contemplating suicide has a decision whether to pull the trigger or not. But when do we get to choose life? The answer is you make the choice every single day. Every single day you make choices that determine your lives and the lives of your children and your grandchildren. My grandfather made that decision. My great-grandfather and his grandfather, your grandparents made decisions that affected your lives and the world in which you live. Each of us makes choices every day about choosing life. And it's not such a rational thing. 50 years ago, when people came out of the concentration camps, it wasn't a rational thing to choose life.
to perpetuate the Jewish people, to have another generation after all that they witnessed. And yet they overcame all of that, all of those obstacles, all of the negative psychology, all of the naysayers, all those who abandoned Judaism. And they said, no, we understand our obligation to the future. All of the questions you ask are very legitimate. And you have a right to be concerned about all these issues. But ultimately, you have to decide what's important for the Jewish future, for your future, and the future of your children and their children. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.